Many of you have surely heard the famous legend of the Ninth Legion, which vanished without a trace into the mists of Britain. Hollywood directors love to make movies about it, building up the mystique and mystery surrounding ancient ruins. But the real military disaster of antiquity took place in a completely different place and under completely different circumstances. 3 elite Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, vanished forever into the forests of Germany. Rome lost 20,000 of its finest soldiers in a matter of days, and the empire never reinstated those cursed numbers again. Let's take a closer look at how this flawless military machine fell into the largest and most ingenious trap in human history. It sounds absolutely crazy, doesn't it? The Roman army of that time was, in fact, the ancient equivalent of modern NATO forces in terms of organization and supply. The state spent colossal sums on maintaining its troops, providing them with the best equipment and incredible logistics. And yet, scattered Germanic tribes managed to completely annihilate 3 full-strength legions in a single forest. This was not just a local defeat, but a true systemic shock that forever changed the course of European history. Today, generals rely on satellites, drones, and sophisticated computer intelligence systems to avoid unexpected ambushes. The Romans had none of this, but they did have an unshakable confidence in their own absolute superiority. They sincerely believed that their iron discipline and advanced tactics were capable of crushing any barbarian resistance. But what happens when your chief guide and trusted ally turns out to be a brilliant military traitor? This is where our incredible story of blind self-confidence, blind trust, and bloody retribution begins. It was the 9th year of our era, and the Roman Empire was experiencing its absolute golden age. Emperor Octavian Augustus was actively expanding the empire's borders, transforming neighboring wild lands into subjugated and profitable provinces. To the Romans, Germania seemed like a wild but highly promising region for further colonization and large-scale tax collection. They built trading cities there, laid out their famous roads, and actively enforced strict Roman law. The local tribes appeared to be broken, so no one in their right mind expected serious, organized resistance. Publius Quintilius Varus, a man with an excellent reputation as a lawyer in the capital, was appointed governor of this turbulent territory. But herein lies the main problem. Varus was an excellent desk official, not a battle-hardened general. He treated the fierce Germanic tribes as if they were already submissive citizens of Rome, ready to pay their taxes without complaint. Your modern office job requires a degree and experience, but sometimes people are hired with absolutely no understanding of the harsh realities of the job. Varus was exactly that kind of leader, naively attempting to govern a wild forest with the help of written decrees. The Roman army of that time was an incredibly complex and perfectly tuned machine of destruction. The legionaries were true professionals, capable of marching dozens of kilometers a day with a heavy load on their backs. After an exhausting march, they did not go to sleep, but methodically built a fortified camp with a deep defensive moat. Modern builders erect temporary bases using heavy machinery, but the Romans did this by hand after a marathon march. This grueling labor ensured their absolute safety at night and allowed them to regain their strength before new battles. However, this otherwise perfect system had one critical vulnerability that none of the commanders noticed. The Romans were invincible in open terrain, where their famous tight formation ran like Swiss clockwork. Their tactics called for replacing exhausted soldiers with fresh ones every 15 minutes, right in the midst of fierce combat. It's similar to modern hockey substitutions, except that instead of a rubber puck, deadly metal spears and arrows flew through the air. But for this conveyor belt of death to operate without a hitch, the legions required an exceptionally flat and open space. Now imagine a typical German landscape from that harsh historical period. These were not the neat European parks we're used to seeing today on tourist bus tours. These were impenetrable primeval forests, treacherous deep swamps and narrow, muddy trails where it was simply impossible to turn around. The locals knew every bush from childhood and could move through these marshes absolutely silently. For a Roman legionary encased in heavy armor, such terrain was a real logistical nightmare come to life. And that's when a man who changed everything entered the scene, a charismatic German named Arminius. He was the son of a local chieftain who had been taken to Rome as an honorary hostage in early childhood. Arminius grew up among the Roman elite, received an excellent military education, and even rose to the prestigious rank of equestrian. He was fluent in Latin, understood the weaknesses of Roman tactics, and enjoyed the absolute trust of Varus himself. In essence, he was the ideal double agent, the kind featured in today's thrilling spy thrillers. Only instead of secret microfilms, he compiled the vulnerabilities of the Roman war machine in his brilliant mind. Arminius understood perfectly well that in a fair, open battle, the scattered Germanic tribes could never defeat three elite legions. The Romans' large shields and sharp, short swords would quickly turn the undisciplined barbarians into a bloody mess. It is not the largest army on paper that wins, but the one that, through cunning, forces the enemy to fight on its own terms. That is why Arminius decided to lure this massive, unwieldy war machine to a place where it would be physically unable to maneuver. He needed to force the gullible Varus to leave the safe road and venture deep into the dark Teutoburg forest. How could he persuade an experienced and cautious official to lead 20,000 men into an impenetrable green thicket? It was very simple. He had to skillfully create the illusion of urgency and expertly play on the governor's heightened sense of duty to his country. Arminius brought Varus a skillfully fabricated report of a sudden uprising by one of the smaller tribes not far from the camp. He convinced the governor that this revolt had to be suppressed immediately before it escalated into a full-scale war, and Varus blindly trusted his best ally, arrogantly ignoring the warnings of other, more cautious advisors. This hasty decision proved fatal, even though at that particular moment it seemed like a perfectly logical administrative move. Var ordered the legions to abruptly change their planned route and advance toward the supposed source of the rebellion. A massive column of soldiers, heavily laden supply wagons, women and children began to make its way into the gloomy forest. My legs start to ache just at the thought of a long march through such dreadful, soggy terrain. Stretched out over several kilometers, the Roman army instantly lost its main advantage, a tight, unbroken formation. The Romans had no idea that they were marching in disciplined order straight into a carefully planned, deadly trap. Meanwhile, Arminius asked Varus for permission to leave, ostensibly to gather loyal Germanic allied troops for military support. Varus gladly let him go, not even in his worst nightmares suspecting that he had just signed his own death warrant and that of his men. While the legionaries trudged heavily through the mud in their leather sandals, tens of thousands of enraged Germanic warriors were already gathering silently in the forest. The trap was ready to snap shut forever, and the ancient civilized world stood on the brink of its most momentous upheaval. Imagine an endless column of 20,000 men desperately trying to make their way through a dense forest in the pouring rain. The ground beneath their feet quickly turned into a slippery mess, in which wagons laden with heavy equipment and provisions were hopelessly bogged down. The Roman legionaries were forced to chop down trees on the march and build makeshift wooden walkways just to keep moving forward. Today, business coaches would call this extreme team building, but back then, it was a grueling march on the very edge of human survival. The troops stretched out over an incredible 15 kilometers due to the complex terrain of the wooded area. The great army had transformed from a formidable, monolithic force into a thin and utterly vulnerable line of exhausted people. The Romans marched not in battle formation, but in a relaxed marching order. Thousands of civilians moved alongside the soldiers, including officers' families, numerous merchants, and slaves. This entire cumbersome convoy created a monstrous bottleneck on the narrow, muddy forest trail. The animals screamed pitifully and refused to move. The heavy carts kept breaking down, holding up entire centuries. This stretched-out living snake of people and carts became a perfect target for those who had been patiently biding their time. It was precisely at this chaotic moment that the first reconnaissance strike by the Germanic tribes rained down on the Romans. A hail of heavy spears suddenly poured from behind the trees, piercing right through the wooden shields and armor of the mortally exhausted soldiers. The attackers remained virtually invisible, skillfully hiding behind dense, wet thickets and the broad trunks of ancient oaks. This was a classic, brutal guerrilla tactic that regular armies around the world still struggle with to this day. The Germanic tribes struck at the most vulnerable points of the long column and instantly vanished into the fog, avoiding direct close combat. In their panic, the Romans simply did not know where exactly to flee or whom to attack in response. Under normal conditions in an open field, experienced centurions would have quickly reorganized the soldiers into an impenetrable tortoise formation. This famous formation of tightly interlocked rectangular shields had always reliably protected the legions from any long-range fire. But on a narrow, slippery forest trail amid fallen, wet trees, it was physically impossible to do so. The soldiers kept slipping, falling into the mud, and getting in each other's way as they desperately tried to draw their famous short swords. Germanic leather helmets and light armor may have been inferior to their Roman counterparts, but their long spears were ideal for surprise attacks. Varus found himself in a terrifying situation, as his world-class heavy infantry was utterly useless against an invisible enemy. The barbarians knew the terrain perfectly and used every hole as reliable natural cover. The armored Romans simply swung their swords blindly into thin air, furiously chopping only at the wet branches of the bushes. Despite the bloody chaos of the first day, the Roman iron discipline ingrained in their very being prevailed over the initial panic. By evening, the legions, now considerably depleted, were nevertheless able to heroically clear a portion of the forest and build their fortified camp. They dug a deep defensive ditch, erected a high wooden palisade, and posted vigilant sentries in the pitch-black, icy darkness. This eloquently demonstrates just how phenomenal and rigorous the training of ancient soldiers was, even in the most critical situations. Modern athletes pride themselves on training to the point of exhaustion, while the Romans built wooden fortresses, bleeding out after hours of battle. Inside the camp, the gravely wounded groaned, and the survivors tried to warm themselves as best they could by meager, smoldering fires. But this fortified camp was not their ultimate salvation. It was merely a brief reprieve from an inevitable bloody end. They found themselves in a deadly trap on enemy territory without the slightest hope of prompt reinforcements. The next gloomy morning, Var made the only correct decision, though an extremely difficult one for any commander. He ordered all the wagons to be burned immediately and all excess heavy cargo to be abandoned, in order to at least somewhat speed up the army's advance. The legionnaires took only their personal weapons and a little food with them, and attempted a desperate dash to break through to the safety of open terrain. It sounds like a perfectly reasonable tactical escape plan, but the brilliant Arminius had anticipated even this desperate move by the Romans. Even before the march began, the Germanic tribes had erected artificial earthen ramparts in the forest, which reliably blocked any possible bypass routes. The second day of the nightmarish march turned into a continuous bloody meat grinder under a ceaseless downpour of icy rain. The Roman leather shields quickly became soaked and unbearably heavy, while their composite bows were rendered completely useless by the moisture. The soldiers were literally knee-deep in the swampy mud, fighting off the barbarians, pressing in from all sides with their last ounce of strength. The Germanic tribes didn't even need to descend into the mud to reach the enemy. They speared the Romans from above with their long spears from their fortifications. It was a brutal battle for survival, in which the most elite warriors of the ancient world were reduced to helpless targets. The Romans bravely attempted to storm these slippery ramparts, but time and again they slid back into the blood-soaked mud. Their strength dwindled rapidly with every passing minute, while the number of enraged enemies only grew on all sides. By the evening of the second day, the morale of the renowned legions had begun to plummet toward zero. They had lost thousands of loyal comrades in arms, their officers were seriously wounded or killed, and hope was fading before their very eyes. The next night's camp was set up without its former geometric order, simply to provide shelter from the piercing rain. Discipline was crumbling before their eyes, and the once great, monolithic army was turning into a crowd of desperate, frightened people. Roman field medics poured vinegar and sour wine onto the soldiers' wounds, trying to prevent a mass outbreak of infection in the forest. It was a harsh but effective form of ancient medicine, though today it seems more like a strange marinade recipe. There was a catastrophic shortage of clean bandages, and lacerations had to be hastily dressed with scraps of dirty soldiers' tunics. Many of the weakened, wounded legionaries simply did not survive that cold and incredibly damp night in the forest. The third day marked the bloody climax of this terrible and utterly senseless tragedy in the gloomy Teutoburg forest. The remnants of the once great 3 legions reached a place called Calcary's Hill, where the main ambush awaited them. Arminius had gathered there in advance all the available forces of the Germanic tribes, who sensed the sweet scent of an inevitable triumphant victory. The space had narrowed so much that a steep hill loomed on one side, while a deep, impassable swamp stretched out on the other. The Romans found themselves tightly trapped in a deadly natural corridor from which there was physically no safe escape. It was here that the final, methodical annihilation of Governor Varus's once invincible regular army began. The Germanic tribes finally broke through the weakened Roman formation and, with furious shouts, launched into a massive hand-to-hand melee. In this terrifying crush, the barbarians' swords delivered devastating slashing blows, easily piercing the legionnaires' weary armor. The cavalry made a desperate attempt to break through and escape, but was overtaken in the forest and mercilessly slaughtered to the last man. Realizing that all was finally lost, Publius Quintilius Varus committed suicide by throwing himself onto his own sword. For a high-ranking general, this was considered a far more honorable end than a shameful and humiliating capture. After the commander-in-chief's death, any organized resistance collapsed and turned into a total, brutal massacre. The surrendered legionaries naively hoped for mercy, but the Germans sacrificed them en masse to their gods in a bloody ritual. About 20,000 people vanished forever in that forest, leaving behind only mountains of rapidly rusting metal. The 3 golden eagles were captured with great triumph and carried deep into the thicket as the most sacred trophies. To grasp the full horror of the Varus legion's plight, one must examine in detail the unique Roman system of military equipment. Each soldier carried up to 40 kilograms of various gear, including food, camping tools, and iron armor. Roman infantry was renowned for its engineering training, so the soldiers carried heavy saws, sturdy axes, and digging shovels. This enormous load made them independent of supply lines on the dry, wide European roads. But in a dense and sticky wet forest, all these useful tools instantly turned into deadly ballast. This famous lorica segmentata, a complex plate armor, provided excellent protection against slashing blows in open, dry terrain. But in the dense forest under endless rain, the iron plates quickly became rusted and felt icy to the touch. Water seeped under the stiff leather, causing severe chafing that, in the muddy conditions, instantly became inflamed and festering. The advanced protection turned into a sophisticated torture device that slowly and painfully killed its wearer. The soldiers were physically unable to remove this heavy armor, as they would immediately become defenseless targets for enemy spears. In addition, the rugged legionnaires wore caligae on their feet, the famous army sandals with large iron spikes on the soles. These spikes worked just as well as modern, expensive soccer cleats, providing perfect traction on dry, solid ground. But when you're marching for days on end through a soggy German swamp, these metal spikes collect kilograms of thick, sticky mud. The soldiers had to take every new step with incredible effort, as if cast iron weights were tied to their feet. Modern hikers often complain about wet sneakers in the park, but the Romans marched in such hellish conditions for several days. Mud packed tightly between their toes, and the leather straps stretched from the excess moisture, losing their ability to hold the foot in place. The soldiers constantly rubbed deep, bloody blisters, and their weary feet swelled from constant contact with icy water. With every kilometer covered, the army's overall speed plummeted catastrophically, and those who limped behind immediately fell victim to the situation. Feeding the vast mass of people suddenly cut off from their usual supply lines became a particular and insurmountable problem. Under normal marching conditions, the Romans ate dried grain, which they methodically ground themselves using hand-operated stone millstones. But during the endless march through the rain and under constant attack, they simply did not have a single free moment. Lighting a proper hot fire with thoroughly soaked, muddy firewood in the pouring rain was an absolutely impossible task. Their supplies of wheat flour quickly became waterlogged and spoiled, turning into a completely inedible, sticky mass right inside their field rations. The starving legionnaires had to chew raw, hard grain on the march, which caused excruciating, stabbing pains in their stomachs. A soldier who is frozen and exhausted loses concentration incredibly quickly, and in an ambush, that means certain death. Acute hunger made their muscular arms too weak to hold up a heavy wooden defensive shield for long. The legionnaires' legendary weapon also played a cruel trick on them in the incredibly dense forest undergrowth. The pilum, a heavy throwing spear, was specifically designed to pierce enemy shields from a distance of 20 meters. But to throw a pilum correctly and with force, one needs a good swing and a completely clear space in front of them. In the forest, where wet branches snagged their arms at every step, it proved impossible to use this fearsome weapon effectively. The heavy spears simply got hopelessly stuck in the dense foliage and thick tree trunks, failing completely to reach their intended target. The Germanic tribes, on the other hand, used short and very light spears, which were incredibly convenient for thrusting from behind any dense bush. The local barbarians did not need to waste precious time on a long wind-up before each new deadly throw. Their small, round shields, made of light wood, allowed them to move incredibly quickly and nimbly between tree trunks. In the close-quarters combat on a slippery, muddy slope, this primitive equipment proved to be far more effective. The situation was even more dire for the Roman armored cavalry, which had always been considered an elite strike force. The horses got bogged down in the mud, slipped on the roots, and panicked wildly at the shouts of an invisible enemy. The riders were unable to gain enough speed for a devastating ramming charge, making them easy targets for a forest ambush. In today's world, this is like trying to use a heavy tank in a narrow alleyway in an old city. The powerful machine becomes nothing more than a burden and easy prey for mobile infantry, creating additional congestion. The pride of the army has turned into useless and expensive dead weight, and the dismounted cavalrymen did not know how to fight with long swords in such cramped quarters. Coordination between units in the Roman army was traditionally and strictly based on visual and loud audible signals. Standard bearers held their banners high, and trumpeters sounded commands that could be heard clearly above the din of open battle. But the dense, wet forest completely absorbed the piercing sounds of the trumpets, and the wall of rain reduced visibility to a pitiful minimum. The centurions simply could not see their immediate neighbors and were unable to coordinate joint defensive actions among the scattered legions. The vast army quickly disintegrated into hundreds of small, isolated groups, each of which was dying desperately in complete isolation. The legionaries instinctively huddled into tight circles, trying to protect one another back to back from flying spears. Without a single centralized command, all of Rome's complex and sophisticated military tactics instantly lost their original meaning. The exhausted soldiers were no longer fighting for the glorious victory of Great Rome, but simply for another hour of their lives. It is interesting to view this terrifying situation through the eyes of an ordinary barbarian who participated in the ambush with great enthusiasm. For them, this was not merely a local war, but a grand, sacred hunt for the most dangerous beast. The Germanic tribesmen fought without heavy armor, often half-naked, which gave them incredible speed in their native dense forest. They knew every narrow path perfectly and could sneak up on the Romans completely unnoticed, closing in for the strike. While a legionary struggled to pull his foot out of the swamp, a barbarian would deliver a precise thrust and vanish again. Arminius ingeniously used constant psychological pressure on the enemy to finally break the Romans' will to resist. The Germanic warriors continuously let out blood-curdling, savage battle cries that echoed terrifyingly throughout the damp forest. They deliberately staged brutal executions of soldiers who had fallen behind the column to sow animal panic among the legionnaires. This primal psychological terror worked better than any spear, completely robbing the soldiers of any hope for a favorable outcome to the campaign. Primitive fear kills far more effectively than a sword, and Arminius knew this rule well, long before modern military psychologists did. But why didn't the stubborn Varus simply order the army to turn around and head back along the safe, well-trodden road? The answer lies in the complexities of human psychology and the high-ranking official's categorical unwillingness to admit his fatal leadership errors. Returning would have meant a public loss of face for the ambitious governor and a full admission of the savage's superiority over the Roman. The classic business phenomenon of sunk costs compelled him to stubbornly continue down this disastrous path simply because of his blind pride. 20,000 of the finest ancient soldiers paid with their own lives for this monstrous stubbornness of a single arrogant man. By the end of the grueling second day of the march, the situation had become so critical that even the most experienced veterans lost faith. The officers began to realize with horror that Arminius's plan had been devised down to the smallest detail and with cold, mathematical precision. The enemy did not simply want to defeat them in battle. The enemy wanted to wipe them out completely from these lands. Exhaustion, terrible hunger, cold, and relentless attacks achieved what no army in the world could have accomplished in open battle. The great Roman discipline finally began to show deep cracks, foreshadowing the inevitable bloody end to this 3-day agony. When we carefully analyze Varus's defeat today, it becomes clear that it was an intelligence failure of truly colossal proportions. The Romans relied too heavily and overconfidently on outsourcing when it came to the vital task of gathering intelligence on the enemy's movements. They blindly trusted local Germanic scouts, who were, in fact, secretly working for Arminius and simply leading the legions in circles. Imagine that your car's GPS deliberately and intentionally leads you into the most crime-ridden and dangerous part of town. That is exactly what happened to Varus. Only the cost of the mistake was not a dented bumper, but the complete annihilation of 3 elite legions. This proves that a monopoly on information often proves far more important than a monopoly on brute military force. It's also worth noting the incredible engineering expertise of the scattered Germanic tribes in preparing for this specific final battle at Kalkriese. To their surprise, archaeologists discovered the remains of a long earthen rampart that wound in a cunning zigzag along the very edge of the marsh. The barbarians had deliberately designed this rampart so that the Romans would always be vulnerable to an attack from the right flank during their march. A legionary's right hand was occupied by his sword and not protected by a shield, which made the soldiers as vulnerable as possible to spear throws. This was not a spontaneous, savage barbarian raid, but a cold-blooded strategic plan for the mass destruction of the enemy's manpower. The Roman Empire had always taken justifiable pride in its ability to gently assimilate foreign elites and use them to its advantage. They granted honorary citizenship to the sons of defeated chieftains, educated them, and hoped to gain loyal allies in the distant future. But the case of Arminius proved that this social ladder could function as a very powerful time bomb. He eagerly absorbed all the best aspects of the Roman military machine: iron discipline, advanced tactics, and an understanding of logistics and global strategy. And then he cold-bloodedly turned that knowledge against his own teachers with the utmost and unprecedented cruelty. The destruction of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest instantly triggered a chain reaction of fear along the empire's entire lengthy border on the Rhine. Roman garrisons stationed far to the east of the river were forced to evacuate in a frantic rush or were mercilessly annihilated by local tribes. All the infrastructure that Rome had painstakingly built over decades, including markets, roads, and stone forts, was burned to the ground by the barbarians. The empire's financial losses amounted to astronomical sums, which seriously undermined the stable budget of Emperor Augustus himself. A single local conflict in the forests set back the process of cultural Romanization in Europe by several long centuries. No modern global economic crisis can compare to such an instantaneous collapse of a vast and promising market. However, Rome would not have been the greatest empire in history if it had not been able to draw tough conclusions from its disasters. After Varus's humiliating defeat, the tactics of the Roman legions in wooded terrain were radically and permanently revised. Commanders began to pay much more attention to their own intelligence and to trust so-called loyal allies less. Troops on the march began to actively use light auxiliary infantry to reliably cover their vulnerable flanks. The Romans finally realized that heavy armor was not always effective, and that tactical flexibility was more important than blindly following regulations. The most remarkable thing about this story is how incredibly long its memory endured in German culture. During the Renaissance, German humanists rediscovered ancient texts and heroized the figure of the cunning Arminius. They turned him into the ultimate symbol of national pride, renaming him, in the German tradition, as the great victor Hermann. The myth of the savior from the Romans was actively used in political propaganda right up until the mid-20th century. The irony of fate is that the historical Arminius hardly thought in lofty terms of a unified German nation. He simply wanted unlimited power for his tribe and complete independence from Rome's exorbitant taxes. Today, on the site of that very bloody Battle of Calcharus, there is a stunning modern open-air museum. Visitors can walk along the reconstructed route taken by the Romans and physically experience the eerie atmosphere of that trap. Metal plates lie scattered across the ground, symbolizing Roman shields abandoned in the mud during the panicked retreat. Scholars continue to discover new artifacts there, each telling its own small, tragic story of destruction. For example, the bones of an unfortunate Roman mule were recently found there. It had been carrying heavy stone millstones until its very last breath. This battle forever shattered one of antiquity's greatest myths, the myth of civilization's total and unconditional superiority over barbarism. The Romans sincerely and naively believed that their advanced culture, laws, and aqueducts made them invincible by default. They viewed the Germanic tribes as filthy, uneducated savages, utterly incapable of complex, multi-step tactical maneuvers. But intelligence and cunning have absolutely nothing to do with whether you wear an expensive silk toga or a simple animal pelt. Arminius outmaneuvered Varus precisely through intellect, masterfully using his own cultural stereotypes against him. It's amusing that the modern corporate world constantly and gleefully falls into the same trap as Governor Var. Huge, unwieldy companies with budgets in the billions are being brought down by small but incredibly agile tech startups. Executives blindly trust glossy reports and ignore the reality of the market until it's too late. The invincible legion syndrome is destroying entire industries because the giants lose their ability to adapt quickly to change. And sometimes, a single smart former employee who has defected to the competition can easily dismantle your carefully built monopoly. In summary, we can say with absolute certainty that the story of the Teutoburg forest is a true masterpiece of military strategy. It was not merely a brutal bloodbath, but a brilliant game of chess, where the pieces moved slowly through the mud and swamps. 20,000 men paid the ultimate price for lessons in logistics, intelligence, and subtle diplomacy that were never learned. And the Roman Empire was left with a deep scar that festered and ached until the very end of its existence. Those 3 empty slots in the official list of legions always reminded the emperors that the forest knows how to keep its secrets. When the terrible news of the disaster finally reached Rome, the vast city was plunged into a state of utter shock and panic. Historians write that Emperor Octavian Augustus wandered through his palace in despair for weeks, refusing to cut his hair or shave. He banged his head against the wooden doors and shouted his famous phrase, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." It sounds like a theatrical drama, but the loss of 20,000 experienced soldiers was a colossal blow to the economy and national security. The empire suddenly and painfully realized that its invincible army could be destroyed by a handful of scattered savages. This unprecedented defeat had incredible psychological consequences for the entire, vast Roman military machine for centuries to come. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were forever and irrevocably struck from the rolls of the Roman Empire's armed forces. It was believed that these numbers were cursed by blood and would bring misfortune to any new unit that dared to adopt them. In the modern world, sports teams sometimes retire the numbers of legendary players as a sign of deep respect. The Romans did the same, but solely out of a primal, mystical fear of repeating their greatest disgrace. What then became of those few soldiers who miraculously managed to survive that forest meat grinder? Decades later, Roman search parties would occasionally find frail, elderly legionnaires living in slavery among Germanic tribes. They worked as ordinary shepherds or manual laborers, having long since forgotten the former glory of the great and mighty empire. Emperor Tiberius later organized large-scale punitive expeditions to recover the stolen golden eagles and avenge the fallen. The eagles were eventually found and returned to the capital with honors, but only a pitiful handful of living captives were rescued. Most of the survivors vanished forever among the barbarian settlements, assimilating into the local population. The Roman punitive campaigns were led by the incredibly talented General Germanicus, who unleashed a veritable and merciless massacre in the forests. When his army arrived at the site of the old battle in the Teutoburg forest, the soldiers witnessed a blood-curdling scene. The trees were densely hung with human skulls, and the bones of the sacrificed officers lay bleaching on the altars. Germanicus ordered his men to gather the remains of all the fallen and bury them with the appropriate high military honors. Can you imagine what it's like to bury thousands of your former comrades, knowing that tomorrow you might find yourself in their place? Despite its successful punitive raids, Rome drew a fundamental and definitive geopolitical conclusion from this long-ago catastrophe. The empire permanently and officially abandoned the idea of making the lands beyond the Rhine River a full-fledged, civilized province. The Rhine became a natural, powerful, and insurmountable boundary between the civilized world and the wild north for many centuries to come. Had Varus won back then, perhaps all of modern Germany would speak a Romance language today. But one brilliant traitor and 3 days of torrential rain forever changed the cultural and linguistic map of Europe. Arminius became a national hero for all Germanic tribes, a powerful symbol of resistance against aggressive foreign invaders. In the 19th century, the Germans even erected a huge bronze monument to him in the forest, praising him as the nation's first unifier. Ironically, Arminius himself met a fate that was quite typical and banal for ambitious politicians of that brutal era. He was treacherously murdered by his own relatives, who seriously feared that he would seek to become the sole ruler of all Germanic lands. A tactical genius who defeated the world's greatest army was unable to survive the common yet deadly family intrigues. The disaster at Varus clearly demonstrated to everyone that asymmetric warfare can be far more effective than a direct, open confrontation. The barbarians convincingly proved that it is not necessary to have advanced technology and a massive budget to defeat a global superpower. All it takes is a perfect knowledge of the terrain, skillful use of weather conditions, and striking at the moment most unexpected to the enemy. Today, this principle is studied in detail at all the world's prestigious military academies, where it is referred to as guerrilla or hybrid warfare. Yet the Germans had been successfully practicing this method 2,000 years before the advent of modern textbooks on tactics. Roman logistics, which had always been their main and indisputable trump card, turned into a deadly anchor in the forest. Varus's enormous supply train, laden with luxurious tents, expensive silver tableware, and personal servants, only fatally slowed the column's advance. When you're taking a leisurely stroll through completely conquered territory, comfort seems like an important element of your high status. But in impassable mud, under a hail of heavy spears, those silver cups offer absolutely no protection against certain death. This story teaches us that excessive self-confidence and a love of luxury always precede a spectacular and painful downfall. Interestingly, archaeologists were unable to pinpoint the exact geographical location of this legendary and terrifying battle for a long time. It was not until the end of the 20th century that a British amateur officer, using a standard metal detector, discovered the first Roman coins. Excavations at Calcaris scientifically proved that the historical chronicles did not exaggerate a single horrific detail of that massacre. Scientists even found there the helmets of elite Roman cavalrymen, abandoned in panic on the blood-soaked battlefield. These pieces of rusted metal still stand as silent and eerie testimony to the scale of the tragedy that unfolded in that forest. Science has literally unearthed the historical truth, which had been securely hidden beneath thick layers of earth and the passage of centuries. The story of the 3 lost legions is far from merely a tale of a random military setback in antiquity. It is a perfect and textbook example of how blind faith in one's own absolute invulnerability leads to catastrophic consequences. The Romans considered their system flawless, forgetting that any system is always created and easily destroyed by ordinary people. And sometimes, a single person who knows your weaknesses inside and out is far more dangerous than an entire army lined up on the horizon. And so 20,000 elite soldiers vanished into the Germanic forest, leaving behind only a legend and an eternal fear. We often marvel with rapture at the achievements of ancient Rome, its smooth roads, massive aqueducts, and invincible legions. But it is precisely such stories that bring us back down to earth, reminding us of the fragility of any human military greatness. The 9th Legion in Britain became nothing more than a beautiful fairy tale for the silver screen, a myth about a mysterious disappearance into the mist. But Varus's 3 legions taught the Empire a bloody and all too real lesson that Rome has never been able to forget. Nature and human cunning will always find a way to break even the most perfect military machine. And perhaps this is where the most fundamental law of history lies. There is simply no such thing as an absolutely invincible army.